Well, good morning everyone, and thank you all very much for coming. For those of us who haven't met, my name's Roy Lilly, and I've been chairing the People's Inquiry into London's NHS. You'll be hearing from members of the panel individually in a moment, but if I may just, before we start, if I could just take the opportunity to say a couple of quick thank yous. Firstly, I'd like to thank the London Eastern region of Unite for making it possible for us to have this inquiry. They approached me to be the independent chairman, and I have to say they were good to their word. They've left us entirely to our own devices to get on with talking to the people that we wanted to talk with, meeting as frequently as we wanted to meet, and we chose the places. This work is entirely ours and it's entirely independent, but it is right to say that it wouldn't have been possible without the help of Unite. So we're enormously grateful to them. Thank you. Secondly, I'd like to say thank you to the panel. This has been a gargantuan piece of work. We've been going for maybe 7 months, I think, and goodness knows how many since September. We've had 7 public meetings, or meetings in public, and listened to hours and hours of evidence. So it's a big chunk out of people's time, because all of the panel, Wally, Louise, Sue, Naledi and Frank, they all have day jobs to do, as well as doing the work that we've done on the panel. So it's been a big commitment, and I'm enormously grateful to them. I'm sure in turn they would want me to thank John Lister, who's acted as the secretariat to the inquiry. He's been an enormous source of knowledge for us and guided us and steered us in the right direction, and of course in the construction of the final report. So John, a special thank you to you. I would also like to thank the people who gave their time to give evidence. We've had everyone right across the landscape of healthcare, from healthcare workers at the front line through to Sir Robert Naylor, who runs one of the biggest hospitals in the world. We've had Dame Ruth Cornell, who recently left as the strategic head of London, through to nurses, healthcare assistants, midwives, working at the front line. So we've had a real salami slice, I think. The report, in the report we make 18 recommendations. We like to think they're evidence-based rather than just a polemic about healthcare. We base them on facts. They won't please, I suspect, the coalition, and neither, I suspect, they won't please the Labour Party either. We've tried to take an entirely independent view on what we think needs to be done in London, and that cuts across quite a lot of the political direction that we have been travelling in. I know from a personal point of view, I've been in and around the NHS since 1974, and I thought I'd kind of seen it all, but I was just frankly horrified at the fractured state of London's NHS. The difficulty that there is for there to be any strategic oversight in planning change at a time when change is desperately needed. I've been horrified too at the extent to which it's been really difficult for ordinary people, Londoners, to be able to connect with the changes that there are, to be able to have their voice heard, both in public discourse and in private. And what struck me particularly was we had evidence from 3 members of Parliament, all of whom said the same thing. They all said that they found it impossible to find out what was going on. Now, if MPs can't find out what's going on, how the hell can ordinary Londoners find out what was going on? And that, I think, is one of my lasting memories of the work that we've done. Our work is over. The work now for the report and its impact continues. And perhaps it's appropriate for me now to hand over for a brief word from each of our panel members. They'll introduce themselves and they will highlight particular issues that they thought of special interest. I think we'll start with Louise. Many of you, of course, will know Louise from her campaigning in Lewisham. Now she manages to fit us in as a prospective European parliamentary candidate. So we're squeezed between Brussels and the duty-free. But anyway, welcome. Would you like to start us off, please, Louise?
Thank you, Ron. What struck me most about this was that it was the methodology, that we're looking at a very complex picture of healthcare in London, and we actually talked to the people on the ground in the front line and the managers directly involved to get a very complex and kind of granular picture of what's really going on. And I think that's a nice antidote to all the kind of glib sound bites that you get all the time from politicians saying the NHS is unsustainable or care in the community will solve all the problems. Here we looked really in detail, and I was really touched by the evidence that people gave. And the biggest impression is that London's NHS is under incredible pressure. And with the best will in the world, I don't see how staff can continue to provide the quality service that they want to provide because the funding squeeze is so huge. And that's something that we don't hear enough about. The government keeps saying it's ring-fencing NHS funding, it's maintaining the funding in real terms. But clearly that's not actually happening at the front line. And the hospitals and the community services and general practice are all experiencing funding cuts. And we need to be honest about that and actually look at, say to our leaders, say to the politicians, say to the government, what are you going to do about this? It's not up to us to find a solution to this funding problem, it's up to them to find that solution. But what we've done through this is highlighted this huge issue.
Thank you very much. Just to underline that, in the report, I think you've all got an executive summary of the report, but I would like you to have the full report, which is available, and we'll make sure you have it. The report is unusual in that it's a gazetteer of facts and figures about London's health service. And I think it's a fabulous resource, not only for journalists, but for students as well, and for Londoners for that matter. But it is a very valuable resource, and on the issue of funding, we actually say that we've fallen behind in funding as not only a percentage of GDP, but per head of population as well. From 2009, we're behind Netherlands, France, Germany, Denmark, Switzerland, Austria, Belgium, New Zealand, Portugal, Japan and Sweden. All countries that have been impacted by recession. All countries that have had the same problems as us. But they've made the decision that they will invest in their healthcare system. And we haven't. We're facing austerity, and as Louise very rightly says, that's a political choice that faces whoever is next in government, and a political choice that we should press prospective members of Parliament on during the course of the next election. Right, I'm going to move on, if I may, to Professor Richards.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I've been an academic most of my working life, and so I'm kind of used to seeing the world through statistics and research-based findings and so on. And I really want to make a point a bit similar to the one that Louise made, that what was so compelling for me about this process was directly hearing the voices of Londoners, and really powerful testimony about what it feels like to have a sick child who needs constant trips into hospital with the prospect of your local hospital, in that case St Helier, closing its A&E because of a reconfiguration plan. So there are lots of those stories that, for me, linking to what Roy has just done in terms of quoting the spend as a proportion of GDP in lots of different countries, it's become clearer to me through this process that we cannot reduce the cost of health spending. What we can do is reduce the cost of public spending on health, but that will only lead to an increase in the amount of private spending on health. And the story which illustrates this, and when I still remember this touching bit of evidence, was when we were in Vestry House Museum taking evidence in the northeast of London. A recently retired nurse with a lot of clinical knowledge about the condition that she'd just been diagnosed with, deciding that despite the fact that she'd worked all her life in the NHS and supported free healthcare, she had decided that she needed to spend some of her pension lump sum on a piece of private healthcare because she knew that by the time she reached the front of the queue, her condition would have already deteriorated so far that it wouldn't be fully recoverable. And she told us this story with tears in her eyes. And it is an illustration of how, not the very poorest, but those just above, will find the money somehow if they're not offered a civilised public health service. And they will spend it. It might not come from the taxation pocket, it might come from the private pocket, but in the end, what difference does that make? It's still, in our economy and our society, a given amount of spend on health. And whatever George Osborne does, and Cameron in terms of trying to squeeze back health spending, that remains. There is an alternative to spending more than we are currently now spending on health.
Thank you. I remember that witness. It was very moving moment. Melody.
Good morning. I've worked at the NHS all my life and still do. And participating in this panel over the last few months has been a real eye-opener. We all agree that positive patient or client experiences and outcomes have got to be the most important thing in terms of what the NHS does and delivers on a day-to-day basis, 24/7. When we look at some of the factors that don't support that process, for example, the recommendation 12.1 that looks at the challenges that the emergency ambulance services face in trying to meet targets which don't necessarily help the outcomes of the patients that they're trying to get from A to B. We can see that future decision makers do need to think about whether they really want to put patients first, because that is the whole purpose of the NHS. It's just about a year since Robert Francis' report, which pointed out why focusing on targets isn't the way to meet the needs of our patients and clients. And I don't think that we can forget so quickly why you need to focus on the needs of those patients and clients and rethink how you finance that in a way that is affordable but still meets and maintains the high standards that everyone expects from the NHS.
Thank you. Frank Wood.
Good morning. I was on the panel particularly from being an active trade unionist in Unite and a senior day committee, the Executive Council. So I think it would be quite easy, and just acknowledging the role that London needs to have played in encouraging this panel, it would be quite easy for us to just come out with our basic ideological position and bothered you whilst you were out shopping with a leaflet about it. And so it was quite brave, I think. I mean, there's a world of political difference between myself and Roy, for example. It would be quite easy for us just to put our ideological position. But I think even I was surprised, really, that when we looked at what the current ideological role is in terms of government policy, which is the Health and Social Care Act, it was surprising to me, as somebody who's been fighting our corner in the NHS, to realise just how far that journey in terms of the business, transforming the NHS into a business, going down the healthcare model that says the healthcare is a business, just how far that had gone. So the shortest recommendation, in a way, recommendation 5, which is to immediately repeal that act and stop going down that road, stop making the NHS a business because it's causing almost irreparable harm to healthcare and fragmenting what should be, and for many Londoners is a healthcare which you can be proud. That's a very clear recommendation, and there's such a lot now additionally to support that. Not just the evidence of healthcare staff, but chief executives and health economists. So I think that's a particularly valuable part of the booklet. So that next time when you're outside Sainsbury's and I offer you a leaflet and it's got that single strap line, reverse the Health and Social Care Act, you'll know that there's quite a weighty booklet behind it.
It doesn't work. The hint of that, of the leaflet. And Polly Toynbee, please.
Well, I've been covering the NHS for decades. I wrote a book about it in the 1970s. There has never been such a tight financial squeeze on the NHS. Everybody's agreed about this, from Stephen Dorrell, chair of the Select Committee, to David Nicholson, now just departing from NHS England. Everywhere we went, we saw real evidence of that. The recommendations that we make, I think, are very important and wise ones. I mean, money is an important part of it. David Nicholson leads saying there's no way we can transfer from acute into community without, as it were, a bridging loan. He says 5 billion, like we don't know what the sum should be. But you have to build up the community services first before you can start thinking about adding beds, where beds in London are absolutely up to almost 100% occupancy. And there is no flexibility, there is no room at all. You cannot make any serious reconfigurations of any kind at all, desirable or not desirable, unless you have the money to ease your path from here to there. On reconfigurations, we listened to a lot of stories, whether it was from Epsom, whether it was from Ealing, hospitals that are going to be closed or have units closed or lose their A&Es. We didn't feel, I think rightly, that we were in a position to judge which reconfigurations were right or wrong. What's quite plain is that right across the country, the idea that there is a template, that it is always right to do one thing or the other. Each area of London was very different, had very different problems, different reasons why they were running into bankruptcies, despite the overall lack of money. And so we haven't said we think this or that hospital is right, but what we've said is here are the rules for how we should think about reconfigurations. Obviously the NHS is never set in Aspie. You know, there should be a strategic authority for London. It's impossible to do these things in any rational way without putting back an overall strategic authority that has to look at GPs as well. The fact that 40% of GPs in London are single and double-handed practices. We need to think again about reconfiguring them, but that can't be done in a piecemeal way by lots of CCGs. CCGs are still very weak, we found, in most places. These sorts of views were very widely held right across the board. This may be run by a trade union, but people like Sir Robert Naylor, great panjandrum of the NHS in London, the head of UCLH, regarded the Health and Social Care Act as an unmitigated disaster, that CCGs don't work, CSUs don't work. It led to disintegration and not to integration and not to creating the sorts of pathways we've seen, as with the stroke pathways, that are enormously successful. So removing that competition clause, and as for it, when it comes to reconfigurations, clause 119 will make the opposite of what we recommend, that things can just be imposed without any transparency, without any research being done to produce hard evidence as to why one path rather than another is better, and without any public meetings or accountability. So I think there's a lot in here for the next election, for the governments, for the parties to look at, but also for the mayoral election too, as to what a crisis London NHS is in.
Thank you very much. We are very happy to take questions. Just, if I may, just pick up on something Polly said. There's two words that seem to be missing everywhere in the reconfiguration discussion, and that's needs assessment. I remember when we used to do needs assessments and find out what people's needs were, and then try and wrap the services around needs. Now the needs are not the assessment of people's needs, but the needs more of the financial needs, I think. And section 119 that came late on during our deliberations. If no one has learned nothing from Lewisham, then no one can run successful health service. It just seems to be a disaster that they're just making the same mistakes again, and this time entrenching them in law. Anyway, we're all yours. Far away. If you'd be kind enough just to tell us who you are and where you're from, and who you would like to answer your question. Don't be shy. No questions? Yes.
Ross Lyden from Evening Standard. it's really a question for the panel as a whole. The new London Strategic Health Authority that you're calling for, do you think that should be led by the Mayor?
We don't say who it should be led by. We know that the Mayor is looking at, he's appointed a strategic advisor in someone no better than Dame Ruth Carnell, who of course used to run. And her view is that the Mayor should have a leading role, rather like the Mayor does in New York in leading health services. Whether it's the Mayor or who it is, we don't actually make a decision. What we say is that a strategic overview is required. My personal view is, speaking as an ex-Mayor, I would quite like to see that in the purview of the role of the Mayor, but the panel perhaps will have a different view on who the individual is. But, and we mustn't be swayed by the fact that it is Boris and he does bring with him a certain amount of character and luggage, if I can put it politely like that. It's not to everyone's taste, but if we can look beyond that and say who best placed within the existing structures to have an overview on healthcare, then it could well be the Mayor's office. But what we do say unanimously, I think, is the fact that the lack of a strategic focal point and an overview is damaging London's healthcare. It simply can't be reconfigured properly and sensibly without someone being able to step back and take a strategic view. I'm now probably going to be contradicted entirely by my team colleague, Sue, and then...
Okay, I just want to use the phrase democratic deficit in this context, because I think we're clear that not only is there a lack of a strategic overview, but the overview needs to be grounded in democratic accountability. And so how you do that, I'm not going to disagree with you, although if we had longer to have fisticuffs, we probably would. And I'd probably say that a more collective democratic process than the individual mayor would do it. But that's slightly by the way. That what's just very, very clear is that you need locally elected people who are accountable to the population to be involved critically in making these decisions. It cannot just be faceless bureaucrats involved.
Louise?
Yes, I agree. And, we don't want a reproduction of the old London Strategic Health Authority, precisely because of reasons that Sue gave. We'd like something with much more of a democratic element and actually much more participation. We've got in our possibly London boroughs, because of course the boroughs have got a lot of work to do with social care and coordinating health and social care and public health. So this is an area where they should be having input, and also the CCGs, whatever form things may take. These are clinicians should be able to shape, but also patients. There should be our elected representatives should be able to shape services in London in a way that's really directly accountable and not remote.
Thank you. What we did, just to follow if I may, we did receive evidence from Sir Steve Bullock, who is the Mayor of Lewisham, and we found him a very impressive witness. He understood, he kind of got it, the relationship between health and social care. He'd gone out of his way, I think, to understand it and to bring about change. Unfortunately, there's only one Steve Bullock. That's the problem. If we could, we'd bottle him and sell him across London, I think we would. He was very impressive. If I just might go on from your question, we do make a recommendation about the future of Health Watch, which is something that we had a lot of thinking about. We are suggesting, in fact, that they go. Not because we're not great fans of the people who put in so much time and effort to make them work. It's just that we feel that they don't work. And some of us on the panel are old enough to remember community health councils, where I know when I ran a hospital, the community health councils frightened me to death when they turned up. I think we look back rather fondly on the community health council model, and we do have some discussion about that in the report. Right. Anyone else? Yes, Roger. Roger Steele.
Yeah, Roger Steele from Healthcare Audit Consultants. We attended several of the hearings from around London. And,
you did. You deserve a medal.
Well, and the one thing that struck me is that it's not the same everywhere, but there are some red flags that I would like you to raise, which doesn't come across, I don't think, in your report, but there are some very big problems in particular places. I'm thinking about East London, around the Barts, and the Whipps Cross area. I'm thinking about in South London, which were generated by the excess costs of the village hospital, and around other prospective developments that people want to happen, but they know that they can't afford it. So what I think I would like you to comment on is whether or not you too have identified that there are some particular issues in particular places, and whether or not there are things that you have put forward to address those.
I'll happily give way to any of my colleagues who want to respond to that, but just to sort of start us off. As Polly said, we were at pains not to make a comment on any of the reconfiguration plans. We didn't feel qualified to do that. We hadn't seen all the information, all the data and all the rest of it. We just felt we couldn't do it. What we did feel was, as you have highlighted, there is a sort of general chaos in the system where people are pulling in all kinds of different directions, where a lot of the problems are similar, but the solutions imposed are not. We do make a recommendation about PFI, where we feel that debt should be rolled up and dealt with centrally, either through the tariff or through the capital allowances that hospitals have. It just seems to me that PFI was one of those things where you could look back and say, well, look, it was a good idea at the time. It was done, in the best of good faith, because we thought at the time, and I was around at the time, we thought at the time that it was the only show in town to get some money into the system. Of course, it's gone. I think a lot of us would say feral. Perhaps is the best, politest word I can find. It's the PFI, the Private Feral Initiative, and we've got ourselves into a situation now where it's creating so many hotspots and locked in so many health configurations that they just can't be changed. So it seems to me that a logical thing to do, which is within the purview of the Treasury to do, would be to take it back centrally, because it's still essentially on the government's balance sheet, and adjust the payments through the tariff. That's one of the ways that we think it could be dealt with. So I'm sorry not to provide you with the specific answer that you want, but we never saw it as our role to comment on the individual complexities and the difficulties that there are facing some hospitals. A lot, of course, of which are legacy problems. John. Well, John is a sage on all matters.
If I could just add in the full report, there is a discussion of the different sector plans, and naming a couple of those ones you mentioned. Also South West London, where there has been a long attempt at reconfiguring, which has now hit the buffers and had to be relaunched in a new form. So it is referred to in the full report. But as Roy said, we decided, because we wanted this to be the panel's report on what we heard from the inquiry process, and not simply me writing on behalf of the panel material I might have done from other discussions elsewhere, that we didn't take a firm view on each of the reconfigurations. But we do flag up the issues, and certainly North East London, with both the Barts PFI, which is obviously a massive issue, and the Barking and Havering Redbridge PFI, which is driving the problems out further east in London, they are clearly identified in the report.
Yes, I apologise for that. I rather sold the report short there. It is, as I said, it is a gazetteer of data and information, and it's also a very valuable history lesson because we've managed to plot the woes and direction of London going back to, well, I don't know, when Florence Nightingale used to come to work on a bike. Right, Louise, yes.
One short area I think is mental health, which I think has been highlighted in the report, that 20% cuts to the tariff, mental health tariff, lack of specialist beds, so that vulnerable patients are not able to be admitted in London. Quite often they're sent to other parts of the country, and even so that's just, it's the Cinderella service. It was supposed to be given equality of status in terms of time to waiting times. And yet you are having to wait 18 months sometimes for a child mental health assessment. I'm finding that, where I work. So that's one area. I think also, we don't talk much about GPs, primary care, but the squeeze on primary care is phenomenal. the demand's going up, the investment's gone down, the number of GPs is inadequate to meet the needs, so that's another kind of hotspot area.
Yes, I'll come to you in a second too. Just to follow on from that, we do make the point that it's hopeless just saying that we're going to transfer services from secondary care to primary care, where primary care is woefully unprepared. I think 70% of the GP estate in London is either incapable of expansion or can't get a planning consent. So, where are you going to put all this extra work? It seems to me to be a completely daft policy. Anyway, Professor.
Very quick one. I just want to draw attention to the impact on health equalities of some of the reconfigurations. And they're often dressed up as, you get better service, more consultant-led, 24-hour cover. But actually, they're done at the expense, and often for PFI reasons, done at the expense of closing accessible local hospitals, which frail, elderly, vulnerable people know close to home, they're familiar with the staff, there's a capacity to connect up across the boundaries of home and hospital and community there, which seem to be just being thrown away when actually that's absolutely critical to the success of the NHS in the future, as the Oldham report on integrated care suggests the need to actually design services around the people who need them, as Roy said at the beginning, is being overridden by the need to pay off the PFI debts. So, 2 empty floors in the London hospital need to be filled by closing older, less convenient hospitals, but very convenient for the people who live in them.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
I think one of the problems is that statistics might very often show that closing a smaller local district general hospital, or closing chunks of it, will give you better results if you put it in a specialist hub, which is what David Nicholson has been talking about as he leaves. It would take very fine research to work out how many people would benefit from that, whether the majority of patients who go to a local hospital and who are old, frail, maybe very often ethnic minority women who are not used to travelling at all far, have pushchairs to take children to, whether only a relatively small number of people will benefit from supersonic success rates in a much further off place compared to the general community benefiting by having a hospital on their doorstep. It's very difficult to weigh up. It always has to be weighed in the balance both ways. And there is such a tendency for it to be driven by the high statistics, the success statistics, without stopping to think, who does it really help most?
Yes. I'll just come in 1 second. We do refer in the report to some McKinsey work done some years ago where they recommended that services should be transferred from secondary care into the community. I think the figure they used was 10%, and it was plucked out of the air. It was a nice round 10%. It wasn't 9.8 or 10.3. It was just let's flip a coin, I think. And there's absolutely no evidence to support any of that. And in fact, there's increasing evidence that it might be suspect. Anyway, sorry. Please.
John Livingston, freelance journalist. It's a question for John Listers, but also to the whole panel. If the worst aspects of the Health and Social Care Act are not repealed, are people in London going to die that don't have to?
Well, that's a nice neutral question for you, John, isn't it? Yes.
Well,
No, is the answer.
well,
or yes.
Well, the services will be fragmented, and as services lose in the competitive market that would open up under the Act, yes, it will make it more difficult for people to access services. Yes, in principle, people would die. I mean, like, if you want to put my number on it, I can't do it. If you want to show me exactly how, I can't do it. But if you drive forward a system that is already being shown to fragment and to put at risk some services, monitor themselves, are actually called on foundation trusts to focus only on those services that can make a surplus. So if you're going to have trusts actually driven by the market that's been created into pulling out services that don't make a surplus, many of them will be pulling out of emergency services because they don't make a surplus. Many of them are rapidly run at a loss. Okay, so the reality is it will become harder and harder to get the treatment you need. Some of that treatment will be urgent and some of that will be life-threatening. if they don't access it. That's
Can I just say that,
the most balanced answer I can give you to that question.
people will die is, in a way, a slightly misleading way of putting it, because any misallocation of NHS funds, inevitably, more people will die or get sick or stay sick than if you spend them better. So that it's a slightly misleading way of putting it about any one specific thing. Also, the counting up who has died, as in the Francis report, which did not say how many people had died amidst deaths, which endless press reports. You know, it is written in. Jarman thinks he knows exactly how to do it. Nobody knows how to do that, and it's not clear, even within one space of time within one hospital, like mid-staffs. They are often really misleading, those death statistics, and everybody, journalists particularly, should be very wary of them.
I think that's a salutary warning. I mean, I don't want the headline from this committee being that the committee says people will die of blah blah blah. That's not what we're saying. I mean, if you look at HSMRs, which is what Polly's just been referring to, there's even an argument over that. The only way you'll find out is to do individual case reviews, which is what Keogh is now trying to do. And if we were to really have a real interest in how successful the NHS is, that everyone should have an individual case review, and some hospitals are starting to do it, in fairness. But it is true, if resources are misallocated and if resources are slim, then the response from the health service is poorer and people do less well. And so I think that's probably the most logical answer to that.
Absolutely, and I think it's really people will suffer. You don't know them. I remember when huge cuts when I was GP, that was about huge cuts, and people had to wait something like 3 years to get a hip replacement. And I remember an elderly lady who was in terrible, terrible pain, and all the other painkillers could help her. She was in her 80s, and she would actually have benefited from a hip replacement. And she died before she could get that done. And that would have made such a difference to her last few years of life. So I think it's more to do with the quality of care and people suffering that I worry about.
Okay, we're just waiting for the pianist to finish. I'll come to that. Frank, it's not very nice interview. That's right. We're in a meeting. We'll call you back. Right, thank you, Frank.
I think also the thing is, there was one example we were given of mothers with new babies, and with 2 separate contracts. And one contract from one of the commissioners provided for advice to the mothers on breastfeeding, and the other contract didn't, and they've been in next beds to each other. What you can say is that those mothers who received advice, their children would start out with a far healthier outlook than the other women. And so there was numerous examples like that, but I think it was a particularly telling example of the fact that when you're commissioning services and you're just commissioning bottom dollar, then the chances and the healthy outlook for people, the outcomes, are going to be affected. So, I mean, to me, a big trade unionist, the fast die young. It's not just about whether you die. It's also about how healthy a life you have, isn't it, in time?
It's a complex thing. I would refer you to the World Health Organization's data set on this, which is really quite interesting. And caries in children's teeth under 5, which is a very good indicator of wellness and healthcare in kids. And I can't call the figures to mind, but I'm pretty sure is that we're in the bottom quartile in London. Just more.
Hi.
Thank you.
Yes, on 3 points. On the personal front, I'm a patient of Lewisham Hospital and a large hospital. And the care and the coordination at Lewisham Hospital has been infinitely better by a long way than the care coordination I've had at the large hospital, to the extent I had to phone the chief executive of the large hospital to say, hello, I've been waiting 6 months. So, and he's going to be cross with me because that's now on camera. I won't name the hospital. Secondly, the reconfiguration in northwest London that's already underway, that has been met with quite rightly, much protest, is absolutely sounds like a recipe for chaos, in as much as, for example, an oncology patient turned up at Charing Cross this week for her normal appointment for, I think it's chemo, and she was told she would have to go to Hammersmith Hospital in that morning or afternoon, whenever her appointment. So she'd been sent to the wrong hospital. Her normal hospital is Charing Cross, and she's now been relocated to Hammersmith. So this is about quality of life, etc. And can I also flag up the fact that you were talking about the mayor having some kind of responsibility for coordinating this? We have a mayor at the moment whose prime objective is not necessarily health, because that is not part of the bag. Can I just say
let's
the
not go down the
transport...
road with the mayor.
No, no.
Please answer us a question.
Right, and then I need to flag this up because it's important. The Transport for London bill, which is a private bill that was intercepted at the last minute last week, has a massive public health implication for Greater London. And I would urge, and this fits into what this report is saying, so I would urge everybody to have a look at that. It's being whooshed through the Commons at the moment under the radar.
Right.
Okay?
Thank you for that. That's more reading. Yeah, yes.
Thanks for doing the work. I'm now Ferreira from City University. I'm also a frontline NHS worker. Just want to pick up on something.
He's disguised himself. He's actually a surgeon.
Yeah, but currently
that isn't to say surgeons aren't working.
a health reporter. So I just want to pick up on Polly Toynbee's important point about the balance between centralisation and specialist services and making smaller hospitals available. Before I do that, I want to know how many of the 95 people that you spoke to were doctors or nurses or patients?
How many? I don't know.
You need to go back to the transcripts. They're all listed in the transcripts. I don't know
if we can give it a huge one.
We got a range. We've got some GPs, we had some consultants in each of the inquiry sessions, I think.
Yeah, I would say roughly 30. Don't hold me to about 30%. We tried to get a salami slice of London, and that would include, obviously, from the strategic overview, top end through to right across the figures of patients and use of the service. But we can give you a better answer if you do those.
Okay, and how well did these people understand the difficulties of achieving the balance of where to centralise services and perhaps accept that if certain hospitals left open, they couldn't necessarily achieve the same standards in certain areas?
Well, one of the things that we discuss in the report, one of the recommendations, is how better we connect with the public. We were very impressed with the evidence that we had from the Lewisham campaigners, and they really understood the issues, and of course they were subsequently successful through judicial review. We have, I think, collectively rather more confidence in the public and the public's ability to understand what's going on than perhaps the policymakers do. We don't think that the current consultation methodology is much good as it is, and since we've written our report, of course, we've had section 119 to contend with, which only gives the public 40 days to respond to reconfiguration. Now, 40 days is not long enough for people to mobilise, it's not long enough for them to get professional advice, it's not long enough for them to get an alternative view, it's not long enough for them to raise money to fund what they need to do. So we think that the section 119 just simply waves two fingers at the public and says, we don't give a toss what you think really, we're going to change this because that's what we think we're going to do. So we're not very happy with that at all. We do look for an alternative, and we, although Sue I'm sure will say something in a moment, but one of the sort of more obvious methods would be to go down the route of citizens' juries, which I have had something to do with. NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, have used citizens' juries with some success. And from my experience of them, if you give members of the public all the facts, if you give members of the public all the information that you have and put it before them fairly in an unbiased way and ask them to make a decision, they will usually make a very sensible decision. Now, there are other methods, I do accept that, and there are other ways of doing it, but what we are saying is that the way we do it, I mean, the upside of this is either the government should say, look, we are going to reconfigure healthcare because we haven't got any money, we're going to do it whether you like it or not, so clear off. Or they should say, we're going to have proper consultation. But where we are now stuck with this section 119 of the Care Bill, soon to be an act, it's a hopeless no man's land where no one has a voice and no one has a say. Yeah. Do we agree? Good
I very
evidence.
much agree with what Rosa, there was something about clinicians and the evidence from clinicians. There was evidence from an emergency department consultant and from a public hospital consultant physicians. And what the ED consultant evidence was that the specialist units that deal with heart attacks, stroke and major trauma only account for about 5% of acute hospital admissions. And the vast majority of acute hospital admissions are elderly people, older with complex illnesses who can be managed in, we're not talking about cottage hospitals, we're talking about proper district general hospitals with say 400 beds or so. And that he felt that there was no evidence that those patients with pneumonia, with acute asthma, diabetic crisis or whatever, actually needed to be in some super centre. In fact, you cannot extrapolate from what works for 5% admissions to the majority. And this work really has to be consolidated, because what we're finding is that the 5% is being used to extrapolate and justify massive across the board closures and services. That's not evidence-based.
John?
Can I just add, we've got a general point that we raise in the report, which is, I think, one of the latter recommendations, is for an actual proper objective analysis of the merits of some of these clinical arguments that are put forward for reconfiguration. Because what we find in all these consultation processes is that you can raise questions, quite detailed questions, about whether or not that process has evidence behind it, and you very seldom ever get an answer. And the evidence that's wheeled out is quite often inappropriate, not convincing, or just non-existent. But because of the process, you can't pursue that discussion and actually get a conclusion. So what we're proposing here is a review in which we set up advocates of reconfiguration and those who most strongly argue for it to produce their evidence, and those of us who are critical to produce their evidence and to actually sit down and actually have a proper thrash out and find out what the case really is. And I think that's really important.
Yes, fine.
I just want to say about the reconfiguration arguments. Very often, managers and some clinicians in managerial roles are put into a position where, driven by financial crisis, there has to be a reconfiguration because that's the only way they can sort out money. The Lewisham story, and in other places too. And it seems to me that a system of transparency should take away the pressure from them to pretend that something is clinically driven when it's actually financially driven. And we talk about whistleblowers, people think about nurses on the board, but actually where we really need whistleblowers is amongst the managers and amongst the senior clinicians with managerial responsibility to say, look, there is no money. This is why we're doing this, discuss this. Then at least you can put it back to politicians and say, you take the flak for this. It's because there's no money. The NHS is taking to itself, time and time again, responsibilities that ought to be political. If there's no money, that's the politicians decide. They can say, look, slap another 2p on national insurance for NHS. Might well get political support for that. Or another 2p on income tax. That's a political decision. And too often, the people running the local NHS services are just being obedient about the money and pretending that that's not the real issue.
Yes, I don't wish to be discourteous to a group of people who gave evidence to us, because it was very good of them to do it, and I want to contextualise this properly, and I don't want people to think I'm being critical, but we did hear from the Better Services, Better Value project in South West London, and they came and they gave us a presentation in great detail. It was probably one of the least convincing presentations I've ever seen for the voice of change. And it was clear that even they didn't believe in it, which is why we say in our report that we think the duty of candor should be extended to managers who should have a duty to say what you're asking us to do can't be done. Because as it is at the moment, managers manage upwards, rather than looking down on the services they're trying to reconfigure or looking out across the landscape of healthcare. So we would very much like to see the duty of candor go beyond just nurses and bedpans. It's important for the managers as well. Yes, and then we'll come to the gentleman from the Morning Star.
Yeah, I'm Tony O'Sullivan from the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign. I'm also a consultant paediatrician.
And you gave evidence.
I did give evidence.
I'm very convinced. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And thank you for this wonderful piece of work. My question relates to the needs assessment that you quite rightly said was absent and is vital, and also the health inequalities that have been touched on. And my question really is about how precise your recommendations are on that. I just wanted to say two quick things. In Lewisham, what was stunning, and this is, although I'm from Lewisham, I think it really is important as a microcosm of the wider impact, especially 119's impact, that there was no consultation on children, which is 22% of the population in Lewisham, South East London. That's over 300,000 children who were neglected. There was no consultation or no detailed analysis of the specific needs of the black community and ethnic minorities' health. So there's no discussion about, for example, children with sickle cell crisis, and how quickly they need pain relief. There was no analysis, and I mean this, it sounds stunning, but there was no analysis of the needs of the learning disabled, and there was no analysis of mental health, which you've referred to. And there was no analysis, there's no valid financial analysis. And what you said about Canberra is really true, because we were told lies, and now we know that the financial package in the Lewisham has unravelled.
Yes, if I may, if I could just quickly say this about it, because it's not our purpose this morning to rerun the Lewisham experience, as important as it is. But I think what you do is you underpin our conclusions. You highlight the fact that all of the reconfigurations that we've looked at, that, as John's pointed out, are in detail actually in the main report, are flawed processes. They are deeply flawed because they start with where they want to end, rather than ending where they should start, or whatever it is I'm saying. I think you know what I'm saying. They end up trying to justify the unjustifiable. You see the managers running up the down escalator of logic because they just simply can't make this work, which is why we think the duty of care is so important. Can I move on to the gentleman from the Morning Star? Thank you for coming.
You described a PFI, I think it's the only game in town, in your view at the time. Yeah. I just wondered how many more months, years it would take of central end funding for another influx of private cash, or dependency on private cash to become the only game in town again for NHS managers, and also what aspects of your report you expect the Labour Party to support.
Well, I mean, you're asking me to look in the future, and we don't deal with the issues in quite the way you've put the question. But I mean, I was around at the time when PFI was, in inverted commas, invented, and at the time it was the only game in town. But of course, it was never intended that they would burgeon and blossom into such a millstone around the neck of the NHS, or indeed to be so inflexible. There are a number of technical things that you could do. You could give, thank you, Polly. Polly's got to go off and write a column. Make sure you're all by the garden. That's what she says. Isn't that us today, Polly? I'm not going to tell us no. I'll take that as a no. The issue with the PFI is, I mean, there are a number of things you could do. You could give PFIs a dual planning consent, for example, on a building, so that it doesn't have to be a hospital in perpetuity. If you need to change it, then you wouldn't have to read through the planning process again. We could syndicate the costs of PFI and spread it through the whole of the NHS. There's a lot of things that could be done. As far as private sector money coming into the NHS now, we don't deal with it specifically in the report, other than I would just say this. There is not a lot of evidence, and we do deal with the dependency on the private sector in the report. There is a lot of evidence that the private sector are actually coming in their droves. Well, if we look at what's happened up in Hinchinbrook, for example, which is outside our area, but Circle, who are running Hinchinbrook, they've run into exactly the same problems as all the other hospitals have. They've run out of money, they've been back to the Department of Health for more cash. they've had quality issues and problems just like everywhere else has. So it's not a panacea. Of course, when you say to the private sector, will you come in and do something, they'll say yes, but they have to make a margin. If the tariff tightens in the way that it is, you get to the point where there is no margin for them to make. And then they get to the decision point where, well, what do they cut, how do they reduce quality, and do they put their brand in jeopardy? So I don't think that there's a great deal in the NHS for the private sector at this time, although I'm sure there are elements in the coalition government who think that there is.
Can I just suggest to the Morning Star that they might like to campaign to set up a public inquiry into the role of the Treasury in relation to PFI, because they're meant to be our experts, and the original rationale was the quality of project management in the private sector is so good compared to public sector project management that you can repay the higher costs of capital in the private sector by doing that and by making sure projects run to time and to budget. There's a little bit of truth in that, but actually that basic idea was then spread across the system, not just in health, but across the board, really. And so we are paying for our public organisations massively more for the cost of capital than we should be. And I think the Treasury have a lot to answer for. It's not just ministers, it's also officials, the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, who should be held to account for what is effectively not doing his job properly. So perhaps you'd like to get going.
Yes.
Seeing the window and what's happening in the whole of England. So
could you just say that again?
sorry.
Just wait for the frames. This is his heart attack, yes?
Ingrid Torgerson, the BMJ, a lot of the stuff in the report seems to be a window on what's happening in the rest of England.
Yes.
Apart from the strategic oversight, is there anything else that's particularly unique to London that needs to change?
Yes, there's quite a lot. John will perhaps take up the story of the uniqueness of London, but you are right, and I think we do say in the report that a lot of what we found it could be seen as problems in other big conurbations up and down the country, our big cities like Manchester and Birmingham and all the rest of it. But London is a rather unique place in that it's not just our capital city, but it's the inflows and the demographics that make it so much more difficult to provide healthcare for. Would you want to say a word about that, John?
Yeah, well, I think that what we do say is London is unique. It's by far Europe's biggest city. It's by far Britain's biggest city. It's the most diverse city as well, and all of those issues make it. There are special problems in London, but it's not a special case on a lot of the other things. The underfunding obviously applies right across the country, and that question applies right across the country. But for example, London Ambulance Service is a single service covering the whole of the capital. It has special problems. And the recommendations we make apply to London Ambulance Service. We're not proposing that would necessarily be appropriate in every other ambulance service. We're asking for example, on the maternity services, we're asking for a review of how relevant these particular policies about freestanding midwife-led units, how appropriate they are to London and the specific problems and population of London, which was flagged up actually by the Royal College of Midwives in their testimony to us. And we're saying, look, we're not convinced that it's entirely right here, where there's this constant pressure to reduce the number of actual hospitals and specialist units to actually press ahead with this policy here. So there's a combination of specific policies for London, or policies which are generally applicable across the country, but with a specific focus on the fact that London has a concentration of all these problems in a way that many other parts of the country just don't.
Yes, anyone else? Okay, are we all done? Yes, did you want to say something? Yes.
If you don't mind, my name's Ray Morris, I'm a member of Parliament.
Yes, thank you very much for coming.
It's a pleasure, and thanks for the input. I was very intrigued when you said in your comments that you didn't think there would be much scope for the private sector to predatorily move in on some of the NHS contracts. But one issue I wanted to raise, because certainly that has been the case, that we've cherry-picked things that were relatively straightforward, hips and knees and so on. But one of the things I'm concerned about is they are moving into other areas. For example, specialist cancer services. Yes. It's an issue that I raised a week or two ago in debate in Westminster Hall. and that's in relation to the huge investment that went into a specialist unit for treating brain tumours at UCL, internationally and globally recognised as a centre of excellence. And yet, contracts have now been placed with 2 private sector providers for that particular work, and it's displacing a huge amount of talent and investment that's within the NHS organisation. It reminds me a little bit about the way in which the regional electricity companies were privatised and created their own gas-fired electricity generating capacity, displacing huge public investment in coal-fired stations, and that didn't matter, because the private sector were going to make money out of it. Well, I think we should be aware of what the consequences are.
Yeah, I think I need to perhaps clarify what I was saying. I was talking more in terms of the circle experiment at Hinchinbrook, rather than, but I agree absolutely with you that there is evidence of niche services, which are sort of the one-off, if you like, the boutique services are easy to cherry pick and to take out of the NHS. The Health and Social Care Act tries to deal with that insofar as it has to be done at tariff, there can't be competition on price and so on and so forth. But it doesn't stop, you're quite right in saying, that some of these services being picked off. And of course when they do, it creates a further interface between their services and the ongoing requirements of that person, often with multiple pathology and so on, who needs other services as well. So by creating that interface, makes a further problem for health service planning. So you are right, and then of course you have all the issues of Monitor doesn't really have a failure regime. So when things go wrong, everybody runs around thinking what they will do. And I think there was a Lister, wasn't it, just recently, where cancer services were taken out of the hands of a private provider who just suddenly decided they didn't want to do it, and we ended up paying them to go in some weird way. So you do make an important point. Yes? Yes, sorry, Sue.
I think as we have done, if you look at this situation objectively, it's so clear that the full-blown market model does not work, that there's a danger that we might get a little bit complacent about it and think, oh, well, that argument's been won. But actually, the argument in favour of the market in health is still there, still ready to claw. It's still very firmly embedded in the ideology of one side of politics, and we tend to think, I suppose, that the Andrew Lansley Act is a millstone hanging around the neck of the government, but that's actually not what they think. And so, I am co-chair of an organisation called Keep Our NHS Public, the president of it, of which is sitting over there. And this is something that we need to be constantly vigilant about, and to continue to put the argument that health is the best example, apart from perhaps climate change, where it also applies, of market failure. The market does not work in health, and we need to continue to battle to stop it happening.
John, quick one.
Just very quickly, one area where we do comment very strongly on the private sector is in mental health and forensic services, where the tariff for specialist forensic services has been set by NHS England at the rate based on the private sector, which actually turns out to have longer lengths of stay and less success in preventing people being readmitted, and therefore winds up actually overall costing more than the NHS service. So the private sector is having a damaging impact there. And the other point is, yes, it's true that in terms of independent sector treatment centres and other types of private sector intervention, London is nowhere near as high as other parts of the country. And also in community services. A lot of the community services in London have been actually integrated into the trusts. And we actually advocate this as a model going forward, that is actually the way we think that these services should be organised and therefore integrated with the rest of the NHS. But it is also true that we flag up in the report that in Wandsworth CHCCG, we were told that they are planning to break those services up and put them out to tender in a year or two's time. So it's not a fixed thing. At the moment, London is relatively lucky in that relatively few areas have actually been subject to the private intervention, but that's not a given, and we're very much keen that that should remain the case.
Yes.
Sorry to be so late. When you said wearing my hat as a public governor for Camden and Islington Foundation Trust, I haven't read all the thing, but did you get much information about the voluntary sector taking over services? Because certainly we've had some information that a contract let by Camden to a voluntary sector organisation has led to them just refusing to pay the volunteers who went in to inspect the wards very frequently. And it seems to me that quite a lot of these voluntary organisations bid for contracts and they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the expertise over the whole range of it. And so services suffer. Did you have any information?
No, we didn't get to that level of granularity, I don't think.
Well, we did have some about them. We did have some about unpaid volunteers being used, and
Yes.
actually by organisations that were retaining surpluses, and we did have a bit of that from different parts of London. It's not, there wasn't enough weight of that to make it one of our 18 recommendations, but it was something that did come up, and it's in the transcripts. You can read it in the transcript.
Yes, the transcripts are all on the website, which is www.peoplesinquiry.org.
Yes.
I should know that off by heart, shouldn't I? Yes, sir. Are you waving or drowning? Yes.
Andrew Bart from the British Medical Association in London. You talk about the fragmented services and the fragmented system. And one of the problems with that is almost getting your message across and out there and to the relevant people. And I just wondered, you started today with this press launch for this excellent report. Can you outline any plans that you have to take this work forward? For instance, will you be presenting it to the GLAs or the Mayor's Health Commission? Where else might you be targeting the information and taking this matter?
Right, I can't give you a programme now, but I can tell you that we have been asked by Lord Darcy to provide our report to his committee, and I have actually given evidence to his inquiry myself on behalf of the committee. Unfortunately, the time was slightly out of sync because I was required to give evidence before we published our report, but they have asked for copies of the report. We have good connections in with Lord Darcy's committee, so I'm sure we'll do that. John is lined up with a number of media and other interviewers. He'll be speaking, I think, tonight somewhere.
Yeah, Islington tonight.
Islington Town Hall. He's on tour.
Ealing next week.
Trade Union Centre at Islington.
Yeah,
just
Ealing next week, London-wide, and Ealing meetings.
And I think all of us at some stage or other have got speaking. I know I've got a diary full of speaking engagements which give me the opportunity to talk about the report as well. But I think we will. I think once the report is published and in the public domain, we expect that we will backfill it by public speaking engagements as and when we're invited. And I think I'm going to do something with the wonderful BMA, the British Machiavellian Association, as we lovingly describe it. Right, and is anyone else? Oh, well, it's the boss. Look busy.
I'm Pete Kavanagh. I'm the Regional Secretary from Unite the Union. I just really wanted to follow on from the last question. I think, from Unite's point of view, this has been a superb exercise, and we're really grateful to all the panel. I'm grateful to Roy's comments that we did what we set out to do, which was give it to a panel of people and not interfere, not set the remit and not set the boundaries. But I think the key point is now what we do with it. It's great to come here today, the assembled people here today to hear, for the experts in the health world to hear about it and have a debate. But we really need to take this out now to the people of London. And from our point of view as a trade union, that's precisely what we're going to do in every way we can, by talking to local authorities, by talking to the GLA, by talking to labour groups and anyone else who actually wants to listen to what's happening to the health service. But most importantly, Unite has got 250,000 members in this part of the country, and we want to get it out to ordinary people about what precisely is happening. So I think that key point about where we take this next, beyond just talking within the specialist fields, is absolutely key, and we'll be working with anybody, including the panel, to make sure that we get the word out there.
Good. Well, perhaps on that note, it's a good note to end. My thanks to you all for coming. I know that somebody wanted to do interviews with the panel, so we're available. I think we've got room till midday. And again, thank you all for coming. And again, my thanks to the panel for their time and energy. We hope that as this is their House of Commons, if we leave a few copies of the report lying around. Anyway, thank you all very much.